November 12, 1978. Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, California. Dr. Vladimir Petrov steps into Building 111, the computer center that houses one of America's most advanced computational systems. Petrov holds a doctorate in theoretical physics from Moscow State University. He has worked at the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy for 12 years. Soviet authorities selected him for this 3-week cultural exchange program because of his impeccable political reliability and his promise to return with intelligence about American research capabilities. He expects to see equipment comparable to what he works with in Moscow, perhaps slightly more advanced, but nothing fundamentally different. What he sees instead changes his life completely. The Cray-1 supercomputer dominates the center of the room. The cylindrical machine stands 6 feet tall, covered in a distinctive red and black chassis that makes it look more like modern art than scientific equipment. Seymour Cray designed this machine to perform 160 million floating-point operations per second. Petrov's colleague at Livermore, Dr. Robert Chen, explains that the calculations Petrov's institute in Moscow requires 6 months to complete, the Cray-1 finishes in approximately 3 hours. Petrov asks Chen to repeat that statement. He assumes he misunderstood through the language barrier. Chen repeats it. 3 hours, not 3 weeks, not 3 months, 3 hours. Petrov stands silent for several minutes, staring at the machine. His mind calculates the implications. If American scientists can perform computational analysis in hours that take Soviet scientists months, then every research project in the Soviet Union operates at a permanent disadvantage. American researchers can test hundreds of theoretical models in the time Soviet researchers test one. American scientists can iterate their designs, refine their approaches, and advance their understanding, while Soviet scientists are still setting up their first calculations. The gap isn't just technological, it's temporal. American science operates in a different time frame entirely. Over the next 3 weeks, Petrov tours multiple American research facilities. Each visit reveals new disparities he hadn't known existed. At MIT Lincoln Laboratory, he sees electron microscopes that resolve individual atomic structures. Soviet institutes have electron microscopes, but they date from the 1960s and require constant maintenance by technicians who improvise repairs with whatever parts they can obtain. The American microscopes are new, maintained by professional service contracts, and available to graduate students for routine use. What Petrov's institute director treats as a precious resource reserved for the most critical experiments, American graduate students access as casually as Soviet students use pencils. The publishing environment shocks Petrov almost as much as the equipment. American researchers explain their publication process. They write a paper describing their findings. They submit it to a journal for peer review. Reviewers evaluate the scientific merit. If accepted, the paper appears in print within 3 to 6 months. The entire process from completed research to published results takes less than a year. Petrov describes his experience in Moscow. He completes research. He writes a paper. He submits it to his institute director for approval. The director sends it to the appropriate ministry for political review. The ministry determines whether the research contains information that might benefit capitalist nations. If approved, the paper goes to the journal, which has a backlog of 18 months. If the paper describes research with any military application, however theoretical, it never gets published internationally at all. Petrov has papers describing theoretical physics calculations that he completed 4 years ago that remain unpublished because the ministry hasn't finished its review. On November 28th, his scheduled departure date, Petrov doesn't board his Aeroflot flight back to Moscow. He walks into the nearest FBI office and requests political asylum. He becomes one of 15 prominent Soviet scientists who defect during academic exchange programs between 1975 and 1989. His wife and 2 daughters remain in Moscow. He won't see them again for 11 years, until the Soviet Union collapses and they can finally join him in California. But on November 28, 1978, Vladimir Petrov decides that continuing his scientific work in America matters more than anything else, including his family. That decision illustrates the magnitude of the technology gap he discovered. Soviet scientists in the 1970s lived within a comprehensive propaganda system that shaped their understanding of Western science. Official Soviet publications described American research as corrupted by capitalism, driven by profit rather than pure scientific inquiry. The propaganda emphasized that Soviet collective scientific organization surpassed American individualist approaches. Soviet scientists were told that American laboratories operated within a military-industrial complex that restricted academic freedom and subordinated research to commercial applications. Young scientists graduating from Soviet universities genuinely believed that Soviet science led the world in most fields and matched Western capabilities in others. The reality of Soviet scientific infrastructure contradicted the propaganda substantially. Soviet research institutes operated with equipment that dated primarily from the 1950s and early 1960s. When equipment broke, which happened frequently, technicians repaired it using whatever components they could find or manufacture locally. Ordering replacement parts from Western suppliers required currency the Soviet Union lacked and permissions that took years to obtain. Soviet institutes made do with what they had, which meant making do with technology 20 years obsolete. Soviet scientists performed calculations that American researchers completed with computers by hand or with primitive computational aids. A theoretical physics problem that American graduate students could solve in an afternoon using university computing resources might take a Soviet research team weeks of manual calculations, checking and rechecking their work for errors. This disparity meant that Soviet scientists spent their time performing mechanical calculations rather than thinking about fundamental problems. The smartest minds in Soviet science functioned as human calculators because their institutions lacked the computational power to free them for creative work. The publishing approval process reflected Soviet security paranoia and bureaucratic inefficiency in equal measure. Soviet authorities feared that any scientific publication might contain information useful to Western military programs. Every paper underwent political review to ensure it revealed no state secrets. The definition of state secrets evolved unpredictably, which meant that papers approved one month might be rejected the next because political winds had shifted. Scientists learned to self-censor, avoiding research topics that might trigger security reviews. This self-censorship created entire areas of inquiry that Soviet scientists simply didn't pursue because the political risk exceeded any possible professional benefit. KGB oversight permeated Soviet research institutes. Every institute included KGB officers who monitored researchers' activities, reviewed their correspondence with foreign colleagues, and assessed their political reliability. Scientists who expressed insufficient enthusiasm for Marxist-Leninism found their access to equipment restricted, their papers blocked from publication, and their careers effectively ended. The presence of KGB officers created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that fundamentally undermined collaborative scientific work. Researchers hesitated to share preliminary ideas with colleagues because they didn't know who might report them for ideological deviation. When Soviet scientists arrived in the United States for exchange programs, they expected to encounter similar restrictions. Soviet handlers briefed them extensively before departure, warning them that American scientists would try to extract information about Soviet capabilities while revealing nothing about American research. The handlers described American laboratories as secretive, compartmentalized, and hostile to foreign visitors. Soviet scientists were told to expect suspicious treatment, limited access to facilities, and careful monitoring of all their activities. The actual American research environment contradicted every aspect of this briefing. American scientists welcomed Soviet visitors enthusiastically, eager to discuss their work with foreign colleagues. American laboratories provided visitors with unrestricted access to facilities, equipment, and ongoing research. American researchers invited Soviet visitors to attend seminars, read preprints of unpublished papers, and even collaborate on experiments. The openness seemed impossible to Soviet visitors at first. They suspected elaborate deceptions designed to make them reveal information, while the Americans revealed nothing of substance. But the openness was real. and the research quality was genuine. Soviet scientists quickly recognized that American researchers had no reason to deceive them because American capabilities so dramatically exceeded Soviet capabilities that deception was unnecessary. Why pretend to have advanced equipment when you actually possess equipment that Soviet scientists previously thought existed only in theoretical discussions? Why restrict access to research when the research demonstrates superiority so overwhelming that showing it serves American interests better than hiding it? The collaborative environment in American laboratories particularly impressed Soviet visitors. American researchers worked in teams, sharing data freely and building on each other's work without worrying about credit allocation or political implications. Graduate students contributed ideas that senior professors incorporated into research programs. Researchers from different institutions collaborated on projects, publishing jointly and sharing credit. The entire system emphasized advancing collective knowledge rather than protecting individual researchers' positions or maintaining institutional secrecy. American university libraries contained international journals from dozens of countries, including Soviet publications when available. American scientists could read research from around the world without restriction or political oversight. They could identify promising approaches developed in other countries and adapt those approaches to their own work. Soviet scientists worked in isolation, accessing foreign publications only after extensive delays and political review. American scientists participated in a global scientific community. Soviet scientists worked within a closed system that limited their access to the broader world of scientific knowledge. The equipment disparities extended beyond computational power. American laboratories possessed instruments that Soviet scientists had only read about in technical journals, scanning electron microscopes that revealed nanoscale structures, nuclear magnetic resonance spectrometers that analyzed molecular compositions, mass spectrometers with sensitivities measuring parts per billion, laser systems with precision Soviet instruments couldn't approach. Each piece of equipment represented a capability gap, but the aggregate effect was overwhelming. American laboratories could conduct experiments that Soviet institutes couldn't even attempt. The graduate student experience particularly shocked Soviet visitors. American graduate students worked with equipment that exceeded anything available to Soviet institute directors. A first-year physics graduate student at MIT had access to computational resources superior to what the director of the Lebedev Physical Institute in Moscow could offer his entire staff. American universities treated advanced research equipment as educational tools that students should learn by using regularly. Soviet institutes treated similar equipment, when they possessed it at all, as precious resources that only senior researchers could access after extensive approval processes. American research funding operated at scales Soviet scientists found difficult to comprehend. MIT Lincoln Laboratory's annual budget exceeded $200 million in the late 1970s. The entire Soviet Institute of Physics operated on a budget equivalent to approximately $5 million annually. Soviet scientists learned that American research institutions could purchase equipment, hire staff, and conduct experiments without the constant resource constraints that defined Soviet scientific work. When American researchers needed new equipment, they wrote grant proposals and received funding within months. When Soviet researchers needed new equipment, they submitted requests that entered 5-year planning cycles and usually emerged unfunded. Dr. Sergei Dovlatov, a chemist who defected in 1979, later described his first visit to a Dow Chemical Research Laboratory in Michigan. He observed researchers synthesizing novel compounds using automated equipment that performed in hours what took his laboratory in Leningrad weeks of manual work. The American laboratory discarded failed experiments and started fresh with new approaches. Dovlatov's laboratory in Leningrad couldn't afford to waste materials on failed experiments. Soviet chemists planned meticulously because they had only one opportunity to get each synthesis correct. The resource disparity meant that American researchers could explore boldly while Soviet researchers proceeded cautiously, and boldness led to faster progress. The defection pattern became predictable. Soviet scientists arrived in America expecting to see capabilities comparable to Soviet institutes, perhaps somewhat more advanced but not fundamentally different. Within days, sometimes within hours, they realized that the technological gap was not incremental, but categorical. American science operated in a different realm entirely. The scientists faced a choice: return to the Soviet Union and continue working within a system they now understood was decades behind, or request asylum and build new lives in America, where they could pursue research using the tools necessary to contribute meaningfully to scientific progress. Some Soviet scientists who returned to the USSR after exchange programs spent years trying to reform the Soviet scientific system. They wrote reports documenting the equipment disparities and organizational inefficiencies. They proposed reforms that would allow Soviet science to become more competitive. The Soviet bureaucracy absorbed these reports and did nothing. The problems these scientists identified were systemic, rooted in fundamental aspects of Soviet economic organization and political structure. No amount of reform within the existing system could close the gap, because the gap reflected the superiority of market-driven innovation over centrally planned resource allocation. The defections embarrassed Soviet authorities profoundly. Exchange programs were designed to demonstrate Soviet scientific achievement to Western audiences while gathering intelligence about Western capabilities. Instead, they demonstrated Soviet scientific weakness and resulted in permanent losses of trained researchers. Soviet officials responded predictably. They ended most exchange programs in the early 1980s. The remaining programs accepted only politically reliable scientists whose family situations made defection unlikely. A scientist with elderly parents depending on his income, or with a spouse employed in a sensitive government position, was less likely to defect because the consequences for his family would be severe. The brain drain's magnitude exceeded the number of scientists who formally defected. Many Soviet scientists who returned to the USSR after visiting American laboratories lost their enthusiasm for Soviet science. They understood that their work would never approach the quality possible in Western laboratories because they would never have access to equivalent equipment and resources. Some Soviet scientists quietly reduced their effort, doing enough work to avoid political problems but not pursuing research aggressively. Others focused on teaching rather than research, training the next generation while acknowledging that meaningful research required resources the Soviet Union couldn't provide. The estimated 50-plus top-tier scientists and engineers who defected or refused return between 1970 and 1989 represented only the most visible losses. Hundreds of other Soviet scientists visited Western laboratories, saw the disparities, returned to the USSR, and spent the remainder of their careers working in a system they knew was inadequate. The psychological impact of this knowledge arguably damaged Soviet science more than the actual defections. Scientists who understood they were working with obsolete equipment and restrictive bureaucracy lost motivation even when they remained physically present in Soviet institutes. The reasons for the technology gap extended beyond simple resource allocation. American investment in scientific infrastructure exceeded Soviet investment substantially, but investment alone doesn't explain the disparities. The microelectronics revolution that enabled sophisticated computational and analytical equipment emerged from American commercial markets, not military programs. Thousands of American companies competed to develop better semiconductors, faster processors, and more reliable electronic components because commercial markets rewarded innovation. Soviet microelectronics development occurred entirely within military-controlled institutes, which operated without competitive pressure and focused on narrow military applications rather than broad technological advancement. Academic freedom played an equally important role. American scientists chose their research directions based on scientific interest and likely contribution to knowledge. Soviet scientists received research assignments from state planning committees that determined which problems needed solving according to political and economic priorities. American researchers could pursue unexpected findings wherever they led. Soviet researchers had to justify any deviation from their assigned programs. American science benefited from serendipity and unexpected discoveries. Soviet science optimized for predictable, plannable progress and suffered accordingly. The collaboration culture in American science accelerated progress in ways Soviet organization couldn't match. American universities shared research findings freely, understanding that scientific progress benefited everyone and that today's freely shared discovery might lead to tomorrow's breakthrough. Soviet institutes compartmentalized research for security reasons, preventing scientists in different institutes from learning about related work that might inform their own research. American openness enabled rapid diffusion of new techniques and approaches. Soviet secrecy slowed progress across the entire scientific enterprise. Vladimir Petrov established a successful career in American physics after his defection. He contributed to multiple research programs at Livermore and published extensively in international journals. His work advanced understanding of plasma physics and contributed to controlled fusion research. Could he have made similar contributions had he remained in the Soviet Union? Possibly, given decades of work with inadequate equipment and bureaucratic obstacles. But he made those contributions in America within years, because American laboratories provided the tools necessary to pursue his ideas effectively. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, ending the political system that had created such obstacles to scientific progress. But the scientific brain drain didn't end with Soviet collapse. Post-Soviet Russia continued losing top scientists to Western institutions that offered better equipment, higher salaries, and more research freedom. The pattern established during the Cold War persists today. Russian universities struggle to retain talented researchers, while American and European institutions recruit Russian scientists aggressively. Current research rankings confirm the outcome. American universities dominate global rankings, while Russian institutions work to rebuild capabilities. The stories of Soviet scientists stunned by American research laboratories illustrate how technological superiority reflects broader systemic advantages. Soviet scientists were skilled, educated, and dedicated. Many possessed theoretical understanding equal to their American counterparts. But skill and knowledge weren't enough when working with equipment 2 decades obsolete, within bureaucratic systems that prioritized political reliability over scientific merit, in isolation from the global scientific community. American scientists worked with cutting-edge equipment, within systems that rewarded innovation, embedded in collaborative networks that accelerated progress. These systemic advantages compounded over time, creating gaps so large that Soviet scientists, who finally saw American laboratories, understood immediately that returning to Soviet science meant accepting permanent intellectual disadvantage. Soviet propaganda told scientists to expect American research corrupted by capitalism and subordinated to military-industrial priorities. Those scientists discovered laboratories equipped beyond their imagination, researchers publishing freely, and collaborative environments that welcomed international participation. They discovered that American science operated according to principles that advanced knowledge faster than Soviet centrally planned alternatives could match. Some scientists returned to the Soviet Union and continued their work, despite understanding the limitations. Others requested asylum and built new lives in America. Both groups understood the same fundamental truth. The technology gap between Soviet and American science reflected systemic differences that propaganda couldn't explain and individual effort couldn't overcome. Soviet scientists expected propaganda. They discovered reality, and for many, that discovery meant never going home.